Hi, my name is Sarah Stout, and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the Prison Policy Initiative. The Prison Policy Initiative is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that for over 2 decades has provided cutting-edge research and analysis to expose the harms of mass incarceration. To give a little introduction to my own background, I've been working in criminal legal system reform for over a decade, first as a criminal defense attorney and then as a state-level advocate in Illinois, where I worked on the end of monetary bail and the establishment of medical release program for incarcerated people. I've worked at the state and local levels trying to convince policymakers to pass transformative changes to our legal system. The purpose of today's webinar is to share some insights from a resource that PPI developed months ago. It is focused on advocacy strategies around what we call carve-outs. Basically, what to do when policymakers say, yes, I'm willing to work with you on reform, but not for people with violent crimes, or not for people with sex-related charges, or not people with drug-related charges. We'll talk a little bit about why those kinds of carve-outs are so damaging to progress for criminal legal system reform, and also how to counter some of the typical arguments that policymakers make about why they're necessary. Then I'm very excited to have with us Jeanette Sanapatin from the Drug Policy Alliance and Lori Jo Reynolds from the Chicago 400 Alliance to talk about their work with some of the kinds of charges that most often feature in carve-outs, fentanyl-related charges and sex-related charges. Please use the Q&A at any time to ask questions. We'll gather those and post them to our panelists at the end of the webinar. I also want to reiterate that this webinar is being recorded, and we will place both the slides and the recording on our website shortly after today's presentation. With that, let's get started. So I want to start by defining some terms. So what's a carve-out? So the reality, of course, is that people can be carved out of reforms for any number of reasons. We're used to people being excluded from reforms because of, for example, age and various other things that can remove certain people from reforms. But just to keep our conversation focused today, we're talking specifically about charge-based carve-outs. So, for example, when we see in laws that we're working on the except or other than, that in criminal legal system reform then refers to a charge or a set of charges. More generally, carve-outs are a refusal to address or touch needed reform for certain types of crimes, even while pursuing reform for less serious ones or different ones. Often we find that our reforms so far have been focused on what's sometimes referred to as the non-nons, nonviolent, non-sexual, non-serious. And every policymaker has a slightly different definition of what exactly nonviolent, non-sexual, and non-serious means, but we often find throughout the country that reforms that have otherwise been very well-meaning and have made an effort to make real change have been hampered because they exclude large quantities of people who are involved in the criminal legal system from reforms. A few years ago, the Prison Policy Initiative did a survey of laws that had been passed in the previous decade about criminal legal system reform. And what we found was examples in 40 out of 50 states that had done recent criminal legal system reform, but excluded people based on charge. And carve-outs can affect every stage of the criminal legal system. So some block access to alternatives to incarceration, others restrict opportunities for release, and still others restrict relief from collateral consequences, or strand people with violent or sex-related or other kinds of convictions with permanent records or on long-term public registries, even when other kinds of charges can be sealed or expunged. Sometimes the first instinct about carve-outs is sort of, well, at least we're doing something. But I want to talk a little bit about why we really can't address the true harms of mass incarceration without paying attention to serious violent charges and sex-related charges and other charges that are often carved out in reforms. The number of people in state prisons for violent offenses increased by over 300% between 1980 and 2009. And there's a huge number of reasons for that. It was basically a perfect storm of tough on crime laws, right? 3 strikes laws, truth in sentencing laws, automatic transfer of some youth to adult court, and then the end of discretionary parole in many states. So you can see in this graph over here how much the percentage of the state prison population that is in there for violent offenses has grown just as the state prison population itself has grown. what we have seen as reforms have gone into place is that these carve-outs are really hampering the ability of reform to touch that huge percentage of the state prison population. Between 1981 and 2016, served for sexual assault and robbery nearly doubled, and time served for murder nearly tripled. And you can see in this graph on the right that despite we have made some serious progress in the past decade in reducing our state prison populations, but it has essentially only been focused on nonviolent charges. All other categories of charges have seen about a 20% reduction, but violent offenses have only seen a 2% reduction. And that's going to cause problems in the long run. As we continue to do reform, if we continue to exclude whole categories of people from our reforms, we're going to find that our prison population doesn't end up decreasing. As we remove people from prison for these other categories, we'll have a stubborn problem with mass incarceration of people with violent charges. We can't do real reform unless we do real reform for everybody. So what I want to talk about is some of the common arguments we've seen from policymakers in favor of carve-outs and some strategies for how to deal with them. And these are drawn from my own experience as an advocate, as well as the experience of PPI talking with advocates around the country about some of their experiences talking to policymakers. So I'm just going to go through a couple of arguments that I'm sure are going to feel very familiar to people, and actually talk about how they might be addressed. Okay, so the first argument, which I have definitely heard a lot, is just trust me and wait. So the idea being we have to start reforms with nonviolent charges, and then we'll come back for more serious charges later. There's actually a quote from Barack Obama who talks about the need to start criminal legal system reform with nonviolent drug charges and other low-hanging fruit. And we hear this argument pretty often from politicians who are actually committed to doing real criminal legal system reform. And many of them actually believe that they will come back for more violent offenses down the line. But it's up to us as advocates to make it clear to them why that might be a problem and why a better approach might be to address all charges up front. So why can't we often come back for more serious charges? The reason is because the logic of carve-outs reinforces the flawed logic of incarceration. When you pass a law that says reform is appropriate for some people, but not for other people, we're reinforcing the narrative that the American criminal legal system's punishment scheme is actually deserved by some people and maybe not deserved by others. And so what you do is you continue to vilify and, in fact, entrench the vilification of people with violent charges or sex-related charges. More practically, pursuing a carve-out strategy leaves behind a group of people that policymakers and the public traditionally have the most trouble empathizing with. So when you come back or try to come back for those folks later, you're in a position politically of trying to pass a reform that only benefits a group of people that are unfortunately the most easily vilified and othered by our opponents. And it becomes very, very unlikely that that kind of reform will pass. So it can be helpful to remind policymakers of how difficult it would be to come back for people with more serious charges. I've had a lot of luck with the conversation. Really? So we're going to pass this law that applies only to, low-level drug possession, and then a couple years from now, we're going to pass a law that's just for people who sell drugs. And I have had policymakers say, that actually would be kind of hard. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll agree with me, but it can be helpful to at least walk them through the logic of what they're actually saying. Another thing to think about is, are there ways in which you can have this conversation proactively and make sure that you ask for what you want up front in a piece of legislation? Too often, as advocates, we carve out offenses from our own legislation. When we actually present it to policymakers, we present it with these carve-outs already included, which means that we don't set ourselves up to have these hard conversations with policymakers. Ultimately, I completely understand, and I have myself done this, I completely understand why we do this. because it feels impossible to fight these carve-outs. But ultimately, like I said, we're not going to be able to make sustained progress unless we peel off the Band-Aid and really have these conversations with policymakers. So I'd encourage you as much as possible within your own political context to do that. The second argument that we hear a lot is, what about the victims? Victims of crime, as the argument goes, want people with violent charges and sex-related charges and other kinds of charges excluded from reform. I find that this argument really comes from one of two places. There are policymakers for whom this argument comes from a place of being actually concerned with what victims actually want. And then there's a second part of this that comes from a concern about how politically they will end up facing victims' rights groups who are very, very vocal proponents of carceral policies. When you're dealing with policymakers who do have a genuine concern that that reforms will hurt victims of crime, this is one of my favorite tools to bring up to them. The Alliance for Safety and Justice has done actually a couple national surveys of crime survivors, and this one was done in 2022. And they asked them all sorts of questions about the carceral system and what they're interested in and where they would like resources to focused. And essentially, victims almost universally say that they would prefer investment in more mental health treatment as opposed to more prisons and jails, that they'd rather we focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment, and that we should be focusing on alternative forms of accountability like restorative justice and community service and treatment for mental illness and substance use. What we can see here is that victims are not the monolith that many policymakers think they are, and they don't necessarily hold the same political views that many policymakers think they do. That's all very well and good if you're dealing with a policymaker who actually is concerned about what victims actually think. But very often, we are instead dealing with a political problem. Across the country, we have a number of victims' rights groups who are extremely focused on reinforcing carceral systems. Often these victims' rights groups, a relatively small number of victims, and we know that sometimes at least a very specific profile of victim. For example, white women who have been victimized by strangers. We know that in reality, the portrait of people who have been victimized by crime is often much broader than what is represented by some victims' rights groups. So we sometimes have victims' rights groups in all sorts of states who are opposed to nearly every criminal legal system reform policy and are there at every hearing and are there for every bill, pushing against anything that would cause the criminal legal system to be more just, frankly. And that can be really hard to deal with. Here's a couple strategies. The first is look at the full range of people who are representing victims groups in your area and see whether there actually is a diversity of opinion. Every once in a while, there's a very loud group, and then a lot of other groups who have more complex interests and more complex needs, and who might be amenable to having an actual conversation with criminal legal system reformers to try and make a system that works better for everyone. You could find unlikely allies. It's not a promise, but it's certainly something to look into. The reason that's so powerful is that whenever we can give policymakers an understanding that the most extreme victims' voices are not the only voices for victims in the conversation, we give policymakers an ability to have a more nuanced view of how they should approach these issues. The second thing, which I know that Jeanette and Lori Jo are going to talk about, is organizing and empowering people who have been victims of crime or who have been affected by policies that are coming that you're dealing with, to actually speak to legislators when possible. Often these are the same people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, and so you can find a way to help policymakers understand the overlap between those two groups. Extreme and carceral-minded victims groups often claim to speak for everyone, and you can undermine their power by presenting another victim's voice who disagrees with them. The third argument I want to talk about could be summed up as innocent people are going to get hurt. It's the public safety argument. It's an idea that including people charged with violent crimes and reforms will harm public safety. This is another one where I think policymakers come to it from two directions. Some of them come to it with a true fear of public safety ramifications for releasing people who are charged with certain kinds of offenses. A lot of them come from what we, I think, at this point have all heard of as the Willie Horton effect. The fear that they will be blamed for any negative public safety ramifications that do come, or any negative public safety stories that do come out of reform, and that will come back on them politically in a way that they will not be able to survive. When you're dealing with people who are seriously concerned about crime rates and about public safety, we can provide them with helpful statistics. The reality is people serving long prison sentences for violent crimes are among the least risky groups of people that you can release. They have the lowest rearrest rates of any group, and particularly for people who are advocating for things like the end of life without parole and other kinds of reforms that involve releasing people after very long prison sentences. There haven't been a ton of studies, because unfortunately it hasn't happened that often that people have been able to be released en masse from that kind of sentence. But what there has shown incredibly low recidivism rates. So there's an amazing story out of Maryland called the Ungers. Because of a lawsuit, nearly 200 people charged with sex-related and violent crimes in Maryland were released in 2012, and they were given a really impressive range of social services supports when they were released, and people paid attention to what their recidivism rates were. 6 years later, only 5 of that almost 200 people had returned to prison for any reason. That's a 3% rate. There's also a study out of Safe and Just Michigan, which is linked in the Carveouts toolkit that I will make sure is linked at the end of this presentation, that examined 1,000 people convicted of homicide and sex offenses who were released between 2007 and 2010, and less than 1% of them returned to prison within 3 years. So particularly when you're talking about a group of people who have served long prison sentences, this can be very helpful information. Another thing that can be helpful in those kinds of conversations is the age crime curve. This is something that I think policymakers and all of us understand implicitly, but can be helpful to make explicit. As people get older, they become less and less likely to be rearrested. And so when you're dealing with a policy, particularly for those of you who are dealing with policies that will involve the release of people who are elderly, this can be a very useful way to help policymakers understand that the public safety risk posed by releasing people is really very low. I also want to take an aside to talk about the question of recidivism and think about help think about some ways to problematize that whole question. A lot of times, the question of recidivism comes to us from opponents who give some number, often a very high number, and say, well, this huge percentage of people end up recidivating. And I've had that word used towards me very often. And that's a reason that we shouldn't do criminal legal system reform. And the thing to understand and to really interrogate when that number comes at you is that many recidivism rates that you're going to be faced with include lots of post-release behavior that is non-criminal, non-dangerous, and not what most people think of when they hear the word recidivism. Most people, when they hear the word recidivism, think of the worst possible scenario. And the reality is most recidivism numbers include things like technical violations of parole. So when you're faced with a number like that, check whether the rates in question are for rearrest, reconviction, or reincarceration, whether they include rearrest for anything or only for serious offenses, whether they include technical violations of a release, and how long the follow-up period is. Basically, contextualize those numbers as much as you can. Also remind policymakers about reporting bias. We're going to hear every single bad story that comes out of criminal legal system reform, but the good stories are rarely reported on, and that gives us a skewed understanding of recidivism. I come from a background of doing pretrial reform, and we just passed the end of monetary bail in Illinois. It is sometimes, especially with a reform as big as something like pretrial reform that affects basically everyone who's arrested in an entire state, it is a statistical certainty, and something we really can't run away from as a statistical certainty, that somebody who is released in that kind of reform will eventually go on to commit a heinous crime. It's statistically almost inevitable. So the way to deal with policymakers on this question is not to tell them it's not going to happen. That's going to undermine you in the long run when it does. And even if that isn't the question, it's just not something that policymakers are likely to believe. Policymakers often believe that they will be strongly blamed for any negative outcomes. One of the things that we can do as advocates is make sure that our policymakers know that they will be supported in those moments. They're going to be hard moments. And we want to make sure that they understand that we're going to continue to offer ongoing support and organizing when a negative outcome does happen. We can arm policymakers with positive outcome stories. We can arm them with understandings of perceived safeguards against negative outcomes, make sure they understand how discretion, for example, functions in various reforms that we put in. And we can, of course, also arm them with statistics, though I would note that in these cases, we're often talking about a very emotional and visceral fear that often statistics kind of can't penetrate. But those positive outcome stories, on the other hand, can be really valuable in sort of providing a counterpoint to those same negative emotions that are so ingrained in this kind of story. The last argument I want to talk about is perhaps the hardest. It's really the simple argument that people like them don't deserve my mercy. It's the empathy argument. We work with many policymakers, even sometimes policymakers who have worked with us on reforms before, who simply think that people convicted or charged with serious offenses do not deserve mercy or reform. I imagine that if you're watching this webinar, that's something that you fundamentally don't believe. I hope that we all as reformers understand that people charged with serious crimes are individuals with individual stories. Everyone grows and changes. And most reforms include some discretionary measure to allow decision makers to look at each person's case individually, right? And pay attention to how someone has grown and changed, what their original culpability level was, how they've acted, for example, while they're behind bars, or what their family connections are like outside, all of the different things that make up an individual person's story. One thing to remember when talking about discretion is very often our criminal legal system reforms allow some sort of discretion mechanism, like a parole board or a judge over a pretrial case, who's making a decision about whether or not someone should be released. And that discretion is often something that's very popular with policymakers. I think they understand intuitively that it is good to look at cases individually. One thing to remind policymakers of is that carve-outs actually remove that discretion. They don't enhance it. When you carve out a whole group of people who are charged with something, you're looking at those same decision makers and saying, regardless of circumstances, someone charged with this charge is not eligible for reform or release. And that actually undermines the very discretion that many policymakers tend to appreciate. So that can be one thing that's worth pointing out, that if we believe in discretion and we believe that that's something that we want in reform, then we have to allow discretion and not carve out every single possible thing that policymakers don't like, leaving behind a very, very small sliver of people. And the last thing I'll say about this is to pay attention to definitions of things like violent and serious and sex related. Especially when carve-outs are written with broad language like that, there may not be a clear statutory definition of what charges that even encompasses. So, for example, there are plenty of states where there are laws on the books that say you can't use this reform for nonviolent offenses. But then there's not actually a list anywhere of nonviolent offenses. Or, for example, in Illinois, there are 5 lists of what a violent offense is that are all a little bit different, and it can be incredibly difficult to figure out from language like nonviolent which list is intended. That can be really dangerous because, unsurprisingly, most of the time, these are going to be interpreted as broadly as possible to exclude as many people as possible. So if there has to be a carve-out, you may be better served by a clear list of charges, so that at least the carve-out can't be expanded to include more people than intended. So how do we help policymakers empathize? I think this is one that I think many advocates are learning to do in an incredibly powerful way, which is, wherever possible, put policymakers in direct or close to direct contact with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. One thing that Massachusetts has done that I've been able to be a witness of in the past couple months is they've actually been able to allow public testimony from inside prisons. Now that so many state legislators and state legislatures do their testimony partially by Zoom, there's really not a huge barrier that stops people inside prison from testifying at hearings if you can find somebody who's willing to help the logistics actually work. What I will say is I've seen some of these hearings and they're incredibly powerful to actually have legislators hear directly from incarcerated people about their experiences. Obviously, also people who are formerly incarcerated can participate in legislative conversations as well, and that can be very powerful. But it's something to think about as sort of like a structural change in your state legislature that could have a huge impact. And there are states that have already done it. And you can also make sure to tell stories from multiple perspectives. Make sure that policymakers hear from formerly incarcerated people, from currently incarcerated people if you can, and also from families. And sometimes, particularly for the stories of people who are currently incarcerated, you may have to turn to things like art and other kinds of creative ways to tell stories in order to help policymakers have an emotional connection with somebody that they aren't necessarily going to be able to talk to. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up and move on to our guests, but I wanted to share 2 prison policy initiative resources about this issue that may be helpful to you. The first is what we call the Carveouts toolkit. I'll put these in the chat once I'm no longer talking. The Carveouts toolkit is basically a document that talks about a lot of what I've just talked about. It includes these counter arguments and what was brought up in this presentation in one easy to use document. And it has all the citations for everything I just said, which as a researcher is very important to me. So if you're wondering, well, where did you get that? Or how can I get the link to that study? It's all in there. The second is a report called Reforms Without Results, which we did in 2020. It's a more comprehensive report about why policymakers should avoid carve-outs. And if you really want to do a deep dive into this issue, that might be a way to start. And I like to close by giving just a little bit of a pitch for the work we do here at PPI's advocacy department. Am I back? There we go. PPI's advocacy department, which is composed of me and my associate Emmett Sanders, who you're going to hear from in a second, is committed to connecting PPI's research and policy expertise to local groups who need the help. We work with groups all over the country, especially small groups, who don't necessarily have internal capacity to have a research department or work intensely with data, and we help them do that. We do a huge range of things with our partners, everything from providing legislative testimony to doing analyses of things like jail assessments and other sort of other documents created by government officials, to helping out with messaging and fact sheets, and pretty much anything else under the sun. All of our help is completely free, and we would love to partner with you. So if you'd like to reach out to us, you can do it one of 3 ways. Well, 2 ways. You can either email me or Emmett. Our emails are right here. Or you can actually use the contact form on PPI's website. We do actually check that every day, and we will get back to you if you use that contact form. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's time listening to me. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and move on to introducing our guests. So I'm so excited to have Lori Jo and Jeanette here. I really think that both of them have amazing things to share about the real on-the-ground experience of dealing with policymakers around difficult issues. Just to do a brief introduction so that everybody knows who we're talking to, Jeanette Sanapatin is the California State Director of the Drug Policy Alliance and is in Los Angeles. She's an immigration and civil rights attorney who's been working on state level policy for over 20 years. She's a highly experienced political strategist and has secured major legislative and budget wins for California's immigrant and low-income populations, and secured criminal justice reform measures for non-citizens to avoid deportation and to access drug diversion programs. She's a first-generation graduate of UC Berkeley and Seattle University School of Law. While at Drug Policy Alliance, Jeanette has been instrumental in helping secure a historic $6 million in funding for harm reduction funding in Los Angeles County. She's also worked to have legislation signed to reauthorize syringe exchange services in California, allow judicial discretion to order treatment or probation for certain drug offenses, and she's worked to secure the Alternative Plea Act for certain drug offenses, a bill that's the first of its kind in the nation to avoid deportation consequences for non-citizens. Lori Jo Reynolds is an artist, policy advocate, and community organizer who has spent nearly 2 decades opposing the demonization, warehousing, and social exclusion of people in the criminal legal system, especially focusing on solitary confinement and public conviction registries. Lori Jo was the organizer of TAM's Year 10, which is the grassroots campaign to close a notorious Illinois state supermax prison, which was shuttered by Governor Pat Quinn in 2013. Along with Solitary Watch, she co-manages the participatory art project Photo Requests from Solitary. Lori Jo currently coordinates the Chicago 400 Alliance, a volunteer grassroots campaign that challenges conviction registries and housing banishment laws. It is led by formerly incarcerated people who have been forced into homelessness due to these housing banishment laws. The Alliance demonstrated how registry laws mandate adversarial police contact and have expanded policing, surveillance, and incarceration of poor Black men in Chicago. Lori Jo is an associate professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And with that, I will turn it over to Emmett Sanders, who's going to lead our conversation with our guests.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to see you all here today. Thanks for being here to help us engage with such a really difficult and important subject. And I come to this work not just as an advocate, but someone who's also directly impacted by these systems. And so I understand how important it is to make these changes, but also to do it in a way that leaves no one behind. And so I'm really excited to actually talk to the folks here today. So maybe we just start with Lori Jo. Thanks for being here. Maybe you can start by telling us just a little about your work advocating for people listed on public conviction registries and subject to housing banishment laws, including folks who are charged with or convicted of sex-related offenses. What are some major pieces of policy you've worked for or against?
Hi, well, first, thank you so much for having me. And thanks to all my fellow advocates and partners in all this work for years of thought on this and collaboration and partnership. So I have worked in different phases as the kind of reform landscape has changed. Back in the early 2000s, I was working to oppose damaging bills. So this was back when state legislators were building up registry laws and housing banishment laws. And I tried to work against these bills. It was very hard to just even discuss this back then. So a lot of what I did was try to talk to individual lawmakers who were carrying the bills. And sometimes they didn't know really much about the bill. It had been handed to them as an expressive law, and they didn't really know the details or what the impact would be. And to their credit, some of these legislators backed off when they learned more. But at that time, people were just adding restrictions and penalties. There were no brakes on anything. And this was while people were kind of building up, trying to be in compliance with federal SORN requirements. Then we started to do a bill analysis in the state house and actually started to work with some very smart and courageous state legislators who created strategies to not continue passing these bills, which I won't get into due to lack of time right now. But then the next phase came, which was when, there was a reform movement in the US that, started arguably around 2012, where people started to try to pass good bills to reform the system, to change the system, to transform the system. And that's when the carve-outs for people with sex offenses or murder offenses or any violent offenses started to happen. So I tried to work with people to either prevent that from happening in a bill or to try to talk to people about not doing that. So I worked on that with several different bills. And right now there's this issue with a parole bill in Illinois to bring back discretionary parole, which is very important to do. And there's, always pressure for carve-outs for that. This was also the case in a ban the box bill for removing questions about past convictions and past involvement in the criminal legal system for people applying for college. So we started a campaign to address that. And now, to what you said, I'm working on a campaign along with people who are homeless on registries, the Chicago 400, and or listed on any of our many conviction registries in Illinois. And we have a bill that, make some big first steps to address housing banishment laws and registry laws. It's definitely, the first step, but this bill would be pretty significant. So that's what I'm working on.
Oh, thanks so much. That's great. So just moving on, carve-outs for sex-related charges and convictions are probably the most common and difficult to address carve-outs, as many policymakers consider them just a given. And often, and to be completely honest, a lot of reformers or advocates don't even want to attempt to remove them from legislation that they're working on. So what problems do you think this creates for the larger movement? And why is it so important to include sex-related offenses in reforms?
Well, Sarah has really incredibly synthesized all of the reasons that I would say and will say. So I'm just doing variations on that. But one that I guess I'd want to mention is for anyone who's worked, on legislation, and we're talking a lot about state level legislation here, but I guess it's true nationally as well, federally as well. These laws are passed, they're lobbied for, advocated for, explained, and passed in a legislative environment, in a state house. And that state house is an ecosystem. And so what you put in that ecosystem is also what you get out of that ecosystem. So you have to think about a short game and a long game. And so when you put information into that system, which you're doing to pass your bill, that affects all the other bills, and it affects the future of other bills. And I think most people on this call know this, but there's thousands of bills, and legislators have to vote on issues that they don't know that much about. They have to, because they can't know everything about agriculture, insurance, criminal justice, and so they're not subject matter experts, but they listen to advocates and they learn from advocates. And advocates usually write these bills, tell them what to write, and they listen to us all day long. And so we are framing that issue a certain way for them, either explicitly or implicitly. And I think this is one of the themes. I have a 4-hour presentation about this as it applies to people with sex offense convictions, thinking about frameworks. So there's dominant frameworks in our cultural and political sphere that inform or even determine how we understand policy issues. You often hear from Frameworks, the organization that really promoted this idea, understanding is frame-based, not fact-based. So the frame is the lens for understanding things. And so people, have a framework for how they understand policy issues, and anything we give them feeds the frame they already have. And our goal is really to shift these frameworks and have people understand the systems that they have voted on, they're supporting, so that they have the accurate information to change them. But a framework says, here's the way this thing works. A framework is explanatory. And so what we could be changing the frame of how people understand these things, or we can be reinforcing it. And I think, when we carve people out, we directly contradict, as Sarah was describing, we directly contradict what we're saying is wrong with the system. It makes it seem like what's wrong with the system are these individuals, not the system. So it's pointing to individuals. So I guess that's one thing. I have about 5 other answers to this, but another problem is that it's not, if you look at the research on persuasion, messaging, and frame changing, and we make a lot of persuasion errors in our criminal justice work over the decades, but the most effective type of work changes the frame. And it's also, and many of you heard of value-based messaging. So if you lead with values, you end up with bigger gains. And so to persuade legislators to change the system, leading with values would be ideal. And research bears this out as well. So when people are asked to act on their values, they can kind of listen to the policy change and include everyone better. But when you've got carve-outs, then you're just pointing to this one person and it takes away from your values. So for example, if we're talking about a housing policy that's excluding people with sex offense convictions, our value is housing is a human need and the foundation for a productive life. Housing is healthcare. Housing is substance abuse recovery. Housing is stability. Housing is, being able to take care of a family. Housing is a human right. Any of these things. oh, but not for people with sex offense convictions. Because depending on their conviction, maybe housing isn't a human need, maybe it isn't a human right, maybe their families don't need it. So you're just contradicting you're contradicting the values and principles that you should be leading with. And then that confuses people about the frame change. It confuses people about the system. And that's the other thing I'll say, because I know we need to move on, but system thinking also helps produce system changes. So the research also shows that people are more inclined and supportive of changing the criminal legal system policies when they're given system thinking about the problems with prisons and policing rather than individual thinking. And so carve-outs just target the mind on individual thinking. Like instead of thinking, wow, people need housing, you're thinking, well, wait a minute, what did they do? Oh, wow. You take people down this path that's away from their values and away from system thinking. So our job together, and it really takes all of us, is to have system thinking and values-based thinking in the state house, in the media, and everywhere else.
A great point. So in keeping with this ideas, just moving on, people charged with sexually based offenses are probably some of the most stigmatized folks in our society. How do you approach policymakers who hold these deep stigmas about the people that you're advocating for? Like, what works to actually humanize people that are charged with sexually based offenses?
Well, again, there's a lot of answers to this, but I'll just go through them relatively quickly. One is, first of all, use people first language for everyone affected in the criminal legal system. It works. It has better outcomes in every single conversation and collaboratively. So there's also been evidence that if you don't use people first language, for example, if you use the SO term, you not only it creates a fear frame in legislators. It creates like almost a little explosion in people's head where they lose their ability to be values-based, and not only for the conversation you're having, but for the one afterwards. So if you're mentioning that in your conversations, where you are carving people out, you're also kind of steering people away from what they should be thinking about in the legislation you have. And so don't ever say the term, even to say SO registry, it's a sex offense registry. Don't use the offender term. Don't say murderer. If you have to describe an offense, but use people first language. And we have a policy in the Chicago 400 Alliance that was led by this policy, and the Alliance itself, led by people listed on public conviction registries, that we have a conversation with reporters before we work with them, asking them to use people first language. And so far, they've always said yes. And I have like a whole description of why they should do that I can share with people. But if we all ask this, we would start to get this. But to the rest of your question, which is what works to humanize people. Well, also value-based messaging, as I already described. Using values-based messaging allows the people to fall under like the category of people who are fathers, grandfathers, mothers, aunts, gospel singers, gospel musicians, etc. So in our campaign, and I think there's some people on the call from our campaign, like Terrence Chisholm, who's the president of Chicago 400, he leads by saying, I'm a father, I'm a newlywed, I'm a gospel drummer, I'm a community member, and I'm a member of the Chicago 400. So placing yourself squarely, in all the wonderful things you are. And that speaks to another thing we do, which is let people speak for themselves and show up, come to the meetings. For years, people with sex offenses were not in our criminal justice meetings, conversations, groups, and they weren't in the meetings talking about carving them out. And now when people come to the meetings, come to the State House, and this is the most, this is like obvious and Sarah already covered it, but when people come to the State House and meet state legislators, you cannot ignore what wonderful, incredible people they are and their humanity. And it becomes much harder to just treat them like a terrible label and an abstraction. As a matter of fact, in our State House, people know the Chicago 400 leaders. They say, hi, Terrence. And it's incredibly courageous of folks, to step up and be the leaders on this issue. It's also incredibly rewarding. People have, just absolutely responded like, wow, these things that are happening to you are terrible when they hear them directly from people affected. The other thing, I guess, is, frame the issues so they're system-based and so that people see them for what they are. Take the focus off individual convictions. So our campaign has always been based on a solidarity model about public conviction registries. Sometimes people on registries or even on one registry will point the finger at each other. Well, they should be on the registry, but not me. And someone should be on a murder registry, but not a sex offense registry. Well, the arson registry is stupid, but and what we are trying to do is help people see the system. So we talk about the registries structurally. What are they? And we do this with an incredible set of drawings that the Chicago 400 folks made that illustrate that registries are a giant policing project. And they're also a convoluted, confusing maze that people can never get out of. So we have 7 conviction registries in Illinois. We talk about all of them. Registries are at the center of housing and reentry. There are laws that require people to collect personal information from people and then publish their past conviction and address on the internet. There's an entire police apparatus for this. So it's a policing project. And it moves people by the 30,000 to police stations, and it moves police by the 90,000 into domestic spaces just for address checks. So you see, we're reframing registries from how people think, oh, they're keeping me safe, to no, this is this crazy project of just moving people back and forth from police stations after they've served their time and are free, 10 years after, 20, 30 years after. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. I think you made such great points. And first and foremost, that just people are people, and it's very, very important for us to actually remember that. So let's turn now to Jeanette and just talk a little bit with her about her work. Thanks for being here. Can you maybe begin by telling us a little bit about your work, talking to policymakers about people charged with fentanyl offenses? What are some of the major pieces of policy that you've worked for or against?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me and inviting me, and just really excited to hear Lori, Joe. I echo everything that she said. I think it's really important to think about bringing folks with lived experience to meet legislators and to also potentially testify. But also, it's really important to lead with value-based messages. So I just want to just reiterate, because I think that's everything you said is just so on point. So my work in California has led me to now work. I've been with Drug Policy Alliance for the past 4 years. As mentioned earlier, my area of expertise is really the intersection of criminal law and immigration law. I've been an immigration attorney for over 23 years, have worked on state level policies for over 22 years as well. And so just, a lot of our conversations around speaking to policymakers on fentanyl has definitely taken up a lot of our time this year. I will say that, just to give you guys a little bit of context, California had the largest number of new legislators elected into both houses, into both the Senate and the Assembly. A lot of new Democrats, a lot of folks that ran on campaigns to address the overdose crisis, to address the fentanyl crisis. And so this year, we've seen an unprecedented number of fentanyl-related bills introduced, as well as many Democrats introducing legislation that we traditionally have been introduced by Republicans. And so this year, to that extent, has been very, very challenging. We've been very fortunate in California that we have some great partnerships and great organizations and coalitions that we work with, not only on the ground, but also up at the Capitol, to really partner on these issues. And so, and I know some of our partners are here today, so just wanted to thank them as well. But, a lot of our conversations around fentanyl and fentanyl enhancements with policymakers have been to just really address, what exactly it is that they're trying to address with these increased penalties. I mean, many will say to us, really concerned about the overdose crisis, concerned about the impact that it's having, obviously, on children. We're seeing a lot of, children overdose as a result of purchasing pressed pills. And so our first approach is to really just talk to them about, what the role of criminalization has done, and in particular to sentence enhancements around drug offenses, but also to understand, obviously, the racial dynamics, right, that occur when we increase penalties for drug offenses. We know that across the board, white, Black, and Latino folks tend to use drugs at the same rates, yet over 80% of the folks that are incarcerated are communities of color. So really understanding the racial dynamics as well as the role that criminalization has played. And for our work, we do focus on the fact that criminalization and stigmatization really circumvents any processes for folks to connect with services, right? If folks are in need of services, folks are in need of supportive services, including things like housing and mental health, their likelihood of accessing those services or asking for that assistance is going to be reduced, right, by the role of criminalization and the role that stigma has played, especially for substance users here in the United States. So that's sort of how we begin our conversations, but definitely we also drill down to what are the actual impacts when you do incarcerate someone that has a substance use issue. They're more than 600% likelihood of dying of an overdose while they are incarcerated or immediately upon release. And we also discuss things that are maybe not so popular, but whenever we do see seizures that occur in different communities, the number of overdoses increases because it's the drug supply is going to be immediately filled with potentially more dangerous substances. So we've seen what the role of criminalization has done, not only to individuals on the individual level in terms of overdoses, but also on the public safety level in terms of we're at the point where we're at because of criminalization, because of the war on drugs. We have a much more dangerous drug supply. And so if we're really trying to address those issues, further criminalization and stigmatization is just not the way to go about it. So those are the conversations that we have. And we do have those conversations with both our friends and also with folks on the other side of the ally that we want to at least give them the information, accurate information, because they often don't have accurate information about what the roles of these policies actually do and what the impacts are for folks on the ground.
Thank you. So keeping with that, what are some of the methods and arguments you've used to get policymakers to understand the harms of excluding fentanyl offenses from reforms, or the harms of increasing penalties for these kinds of charges? Is there any messaging that you think doesn't work well?
Well, I mean, I think, so we do have a report, Drug Policy Alliance did a report in 2019 on the role of drug sellers. And so we often talk about, going after, and again, not negotiating against ourselves. So I take that point that Sarah made earlier to heart, but just really understanding that, drug sellers are also subsistence sellers. These are folks that are either selling because they have to support their families, or they are selling to support their habit, right? And so these are folks that also are in need of services. And so if policymakers want to go after the overdose crisis, there are definitely more evidence-based, science-based solutions that we know are more effective and work. And so we do have those conversations. I do think it's hard to talk to policymakers about the role of the drug seller or to understand that they are also in need of services. But we have been effective in different places, not only at the state level, but even in places like San Francisco, when we saw a city attorney a couple years ago try to impose injunctions for drug sellers in the Tenderloin. We made the argument around drug sellers and why doing that would actually cause more harm, because all of the services in San Francisco, a majority of the services in San Francisco were actually concentrated in the Tenderloin. So we have been effective, but just, it's trial and error, right, to sort of tweak that message. I do think it's really important to understand sort of the framing and the messaging piece. For us, we always start and acknowledge that, yes, it is a problem. Yes, we are concerned about public safety. or I have had to testify against, 100 moms or 100 families that have lost children to overdose. And I start off by saying, I'm a mom too. I have a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old. I was born and raised in San Francisco. I understand what, what you're going through, but acknowledging sort of, what is the issue that they're there for? What is the issue that they're trying to address? But also demonstrating that there are alternatives. So we don't just go in and say, we're opposed to this bill, and these are all the reasons why this policy is just so terrible, but we go in and offer solutions. So I think the one thing that has been really effective for Drug Policy Alliance, at least, has been to have that balance, to one, acknowledge what the issue is, to clearly delineate why we're opposed to a certain policy, but also offer solutions and really talk about what those solutions can be. One strategy, for example, could be, it costs $99,000 a year to incarcerate an individual. It costs $7,000 to provide that individual treatment for 1 year. And so giving those alternatives, providing that balance, and giving that comprehensive assessment, I think really, really does help, because we don't want to, at least from our perspective, we don't want to go in and just oppose everything and not seem like we're reasonable, right? We want to empathize and understand the issue, but also offer some real evidence-based solutions that we know are going to be more effective.
So one of the things we hear is that, there's just so much information out there about fentanyl in particular in the media and everything. So, but we know that a lot of it's doesn't seem to be accurate. How do you combat this widespread misinformation about fentanyl that comes from law enforcement and other sources?
Yeah, so we've been pretty good about being responsive. I know, I don't know, like a year ago, there was a video going around from San Diego about a sheriff recruit that, was exposed to fentanyl and immediately had passed out. And so we immediately, did a press release, we held a webinar, and brought in experts to speak to the issue about, what really happens when you're exposed to fentanyl. Can you experience an overdose or symptoms just by merely touching fentanyl? And so we try to get ahead of it as much as possible, but we also think about who are those messengers that are going to be more effective. It's not going to be me. It's going to be someone, in a white coat, a researcher, someone who with lived experience, someone who's providing treatment services to be able to provide that information. I mean, we know that there is a lot of misinformation as well as tactics that, law enforcement are starting to use. One of the things that we have seen recently is the DEA has been doing regional meetings to convene parents around, the loss of loved ones due to overdose. And they're really just capitalizing on people's grief without really offering real solutions. And so, we also have worked with parents. I will say that one of the things that we did was to sort of combat that is to draft a letter that asks for policymakers to, stop taking a criminalization first approach and to adopt a public health approach. And we released this letter in early September. Within the first week, we had over 100 signatures. And then as soon as we, released it a second time with a little bit more press, we were able to gather over 400 folks to sign on to that letter. So showing that counterbalance, I mean, bringing in folks that have a different perspective. We have, moms that instead of advocating for, increased penalties, drug-induced homicide laws, we have moms that have said, I've turned my focus to working on harm reduction, to really looking at how do we ensure that, Good Samaritan laws in the US are working so that folks who are in a situation where a friend is overdosing, that they are willing and able to call 911 instead of being afraid of what the consequences are for calling for help. And so we try to counterbalance that. I did want to put the letter in the chat for folks to see if we can get some more folks to sign on. But
Yeah, I just did, Jeanette.
Okay, thanks. But those are some of the things that we've been focusing on. Again, just really acknowledging what the issue is and offering solutions, and really being strategic in terms of who we bring to either meet with legislators to testify, to bring in a different perspective on why these policies just are nonsensical and are really going to cause more harm.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lori Jo and Jeanette, both, for just sharing your work with us. And I'm going to turn this back over to Sarah now.
Great. And we do have some questions in the question and answer. Emily, do you mind taking us away?
Sure. Hi, all. I'm Emily. I'm at PPI, and I'm just here to help with the question and answers. So to start, they've been coming in throughout this conversation, so we might kind of go back and forth between folks who have the answers. But to start with, I think this is probably Sarah. Talking about the violent crime carve-outs, have violent crime definitions, like what qualifies as a violent crime, changed over the years?
Hugely. So I think actually the history of this is super interesting. If you're kind of a nerd about this kind of stuff like me, like, yes, over time, particularly during the war on drugs or the height of the war on drugs, offenses continue to be added to these categories in a lot of states, particularly adding drug trafficking and drug selling charges to various kinds of definitions of violence, sort of on this war of drugs logic that selling drugs is a violent act. So a lot of times, if you look at states' definitions or states' lists of violent charges, you'll find just a lot in there. It was often a very easy way for legislators to sort of look tough on crime, right? To look like, they are valuing or paying a lot of attention to a certain kind of charge. There's a really great report by Justice Policy Institute that came out a couple of years ago called Defining Violence. I put the link to in the chat. If you're into this issue, it's a really good read.
Can I add to that just quickly that it's also really important for people to realize these are state legislators making these categories, and they are also the ones who make the labels that we just discussed not using. Like they make the labels for registries, they have labels for predator, for like other words I don't use, but they make these state labels, and they do that with absolutely no definition of any of this, with no criteria, with no explanation to anyone. It's really just, hey, I'm going to call these people this, and it's based on, conviction. And so it really is helpful to question those and not repeat them, and question legislators about it. And we should start, repealing those labels.
Thank you. Another question that came in was tracking back to Sarah when you were talking about discretion built into some of these policies and how carve-outs actually tend to restrict those. And so this question is, does discretion usually work out in the favor of less punishment? And this person says that they would assume it would have worked out in more punitive ways in some of the more punitive states. But how do we see those two things playing out?
So I could do a whole webinar on this question, right? The question of, are we better served as advocates with bright line rules that make sure that everyone has the same result, or are we better served by discretionary rules that are maybe applicable to more people, but involve a human decision maker deciding who is sort of quote unquote worthy of reform? Both models are probably going to have to be a part of reform efforts, right? Depending on what kinds of just what corner of reform you're in. I do think that what you're describing, though, is a real concern that people always need to pay attention to. Just as an example, I helped pass medical release in Illinois, which was incredibly exciting a few years ago, that we were able to get it. And it's actually a bill that has no carve-outs, which is also incredibly exciting. Since it's passed, 52 people have gotten out, which is a very small number for a state as big as Illinois. And the reason is because discretion is being used in a way that is not what the law intended. So we really do have to be careful. I think that the most important thing is that we make sure that we pay attention also to the way that our laws are implemented. We can't just pass things and walk away, especially when they involve discretion, because it is totally possible to pass laws that end up dead letter because of the way discretion is used. Jeanette or Lori, Joe, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think if possible, make things presumptive with, like you said, a guardrail. But if you make things presumptive, then you're putting forward the facts and values that these systems don't work, and the guardrail is kind of there for the legislator. But I 100% agree, you know, you can't walk away and you have to worry about how they're implemented. And in Illinois, I think this is an issue if we get discretionary parole passed, what about our prisoner review board? What about the parole board? And I think the strategy that we're taking is, let's get parole passed and then we will fight the parole board next. You know, fight for reforming the parole board so that there's clear criteria, et cetera. So there has to be, I guess the point is there has to be a strategy.
Yeah, and I would just echo the implementation phase is really important. One thing we look at is sort of do outreach to make sure that folks know about the new law and the new laws that are on the books in terms of increasing the ability to alternative sentencing schemes, for example, and ensuring that both sides, right, the prosecutorial side and the defense side as well, really of the bar really understand how those discretionary models work.
Thank you all. Another question that came in is, Jeanette, probably mostly for you. Are you facing a concerted effort by law enforcement to use the fentanyl crisis and retail theft type things to repeal criminal justice reforms? What have been effective strategies to fight back on those?
Yeah, so in California, we've been able to fight back most of these challenges, with the exception of like one bill, I think, that went forward that just codified federal law around fentanyl and certain fentanyl enhancements. But we've been pretty successful in fighting back these laws in California from passing. However, right before the legislative session ended, 2 initiatives were filed to basically roll back some of the Prop 47 protections that we had. So one of the initiatives would allow for the aggregate of the different offenses to be sort of combined, so that a person who's convicted of a theft or several thefts could be convicted of a felony offense. And so that's one thing that one of the initiatives is doing. And then the other initiative that was filed would also codify a drug-induced homicide bill that we were able to kill effectively in committee, and basically throws in everything else that we were able to kill this year. So we're facing dual challenges in those 2 initiatives that have been filed. But the part of what has helped us been successful, at least within the legislative process, has been some of the things that Sarah alluded to in her presentation, right? Bringing in folks with lived experience, bringing folks from different perspectives to offer up, why these policies are not workable or ineffective, but also ensuring that we work closely with our policymakers that are making these tough decisions and giving them the backup that they need, right? Because in California, I will say that the Republican playbook around these issues has definitely changed. And so they've gone to Twitter, they've gone to the media, they've gone to, really have organized parents. We see, a new wing of the parental rights groups organizing more and more. And so we have had to change the way that we also do the outreach and organize and make sure that we bring those voices not only to press events, but also to meet one-on-one with legislators.
I can add a little bit too about the organized retail theft concept. We're seeing this all over the place, and I do think it's a example of a very specific kind of carve out, where people charged with retail theft are generally a group of people who have been considered on sort of the lowest end who are considered part of that low hanging fruit, right? And what some of these campaigns have been successful of doing is like carving out a set of people who are charged with retail theft as sort of, these are the really bad ones. I mean, that's really the argument, right? Of like, well, this is the real problem. And problematizing that question, at least in Illinois, was incredibly helpful to us. One place that we found an unlikely ally in this was actually in our domestic violence community. The organized retail theft argument is I mean, there are people, right, who commit retail theft in groups, right? And when that happens, one of the things that our domestic violence advocates actually brought up is that often they're in the context of various kinds of unhealthy and abusive relationships that happens. And so we were able to bring those advocates in to contextualize who some of these people are and what some of the motivations and the situations are that lead to this kind of theft. And that was a really, really valuable way to help humanize this group of people that the retail industry is really working very, very hard to pull away from a group of people who are often viewed sympathetically and to make them be viewed less sympathetically.
Thank you. Another question. I know we only have a little bit of time left, Sarah, so just
one more.
Tell me to stop when. Okay. All right. So one last one is, do you have any strategies for overcoming carve-outs for people sentenced under plea agreements? This is something that's happening commonly in Indiana, according to this question, and is a huge issue since over 90% of cases in Indiana are settled by plea, which I think is a large percentage that we see sort of in other states as well.
Yeah, we hear this one. I've heard this one too. Ideas about the reasons that you can't have reforms be retroactive, for example, because they will undermine plea agreements. I mean, to me, this is one of the most transparent possible ways to carve out pretty much everyone from your criminal legal system reforms, right? When prosecutors push for this, they're basically saying, well, let's do criminal legal system reform for literally 10% of people. And we know that the majority of people are not going to be impacted. I think it's important to make sure that legislators understand that number and not just understand, okay, 90% of people plea, but then understand how little effect reforms will have on the prison population if that's what you do. So if you carve out all of these folks, this is the effect that it's going to have on the prison population. I've done that often with policymakers who wanted to carve out murder from various changes. The reality is a huge percentage of people who are in prison for long sentences are in there for murder. And although it's a very quick knee jerk to say, well, not these people, you have to be able to say, if you do that, you will find that there is no change in the prison population. So if that's your goal, you're going to fail. That's one thing I'd bring up as an important sort of talking point. Any other thoughts?
Well, I just want to add that, having value-based messaging and system-based thinking is how to, kind of how to respond to this. And I know it's tough. Everything we're talking about is tough, but if speaking about parole or something like that, making that retroactive, if the concept is that people with convictions who are in prison, they grow, they change. We believe in redemption. They should have the chance to be reviewed after 20 years, to be reviewed, to see who they are now. What are they doing now? What's their potential? What would it mean to have their families be reunited with them? To be able to take care of their parents, to be back in their community. Well, that's true whether this happens in the future or whether it's the people we're already talking about. So if you stick to your values, and emphasize why we're doing this, why the system needs changing, then carve-outs don't really, excluding or, not making things retroactive doesn't make sense and goes against what you're talking about. Of course, there's pressure, but, the reasons are the same to do it in the past as they are to do it in the future.
And with that, I think we'll close out. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Jeanette and Lori Jo, for coming on to talk to us about this issue. Your wisdom has been incredibly helpful. The last thing I put in the chat, because I intended to show it earlier and we didn't have time, was Chicago 400 Alliance has put together a really great video about the experiences of people on conviction registries in Chicago. I've put a link in the chat, and I'll also put a link when we share this webinar to make sure that everybody sees that video. Please take a look. And with that, I will close us out. As I said, please, if you are in an organization that would like to work with Prison Policy Initiative on your advocacy efforts, please reach out either directly to me or through our contact form on our website. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you all so much.